Downtown streets had become a battlefield of noise and chaos that afternoon when roughly 50 anti-ICE protesters decided that blocking traffic wasn't enough of a statement. What started as chants and signs had morphed into something far more aggressive, something that crossed the line from protest into intimidation. The group had formed a human wall across one of the busiest intersections in the city, forcing cars to stop, trapping drivers who had no political agenda beyond getting home from work or picking up their kids from school. But for this crowd, every stopped vehicle represented an opportunity to convert, to punish, or to make an example of anyone who dared to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The anti-ICE movement had been gaining momentum in certain circles, fueled by social media outrage and a sense of moral superiority that seemed to justify increasingly extreme tactics. What had once been peaceful demonstrations had evolved into confrontations where protesters felt empowered to physically block federal facilities, harass employees, and create no-go zones in American cities. Some groups had even started posting addresses of ICE agents online, effectively putting targets on the backs of people just doing their jobs. The narrative was simple in their minds. Anyone not actively resisting was complicit, and compliance meant cowardice. This particular afternoon protest had attracted the usual mix of true believers and chaos tourists, people who showed up because the adrenaline rush of confrontation felt like purpose, like they were part of something historic. But within that crowd, like in any mob, there were those who saw the disorder as cover for something darker, an opportunity to exercise power over others without consequences. She was driving alone through what should have been a routine route home when she noticed the crowd ahead. The woman behind the wheel looked unremarkable, dressed in civilian clothes, her hair pulled back simply, no visible indicators of who she really was or what she was capable of. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another trapped motorist, someone who had made the mistake of being in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. Her sedan came to a stop about 30 feet from the human barrier, brake lights glowing red as she assessed the situation. For a moment she considered backing up and finding another route, the sensible choice that most people would make when faced with an angry mob. But before she could shift into reverse, several protesters had already noticed her hesitation and began moving toward the vehicle with purpose. What happened next would become a textbook example of how quickly a protest can transform into assault when the wrong person decides they have the authority to enforce their will on others. The group that approached her car was maybe 6 or 7 strong, a mix of ages and backgrounds united by their righteous anger and the intoxicating feeling of being part of a movement. They surrounded the sedan, some filming with their phones, others shouting demands for her to turn off the engine and step out. The noise was overwhelming, fists pounding on the hood and trunk, faces pressed against the windows, voices overlapping in a chorus of accusations and commands. She kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, her expression neutral, trying to signal that she wasn't a threat, that she was just trying to pass through. But to the mob, her calm demeanor wasn't seen as de-escalation. It was seen as defiance. One man separated himself from the group, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who had appointed himself the leader of this particular confrontation. He was in his late 20s, wearing the uniform of the urban activist, all black clothing covered in patches and slogans, a bandana pulled down around his neck, his face twisted into an expression of contempt. To him, this woman represented everything wrong with America, sitting in her car trying to ignore the movement, probably heading home to her comfortable life while families were being torn apart by deportation. He had decided in that instant that she needed to be taught a lesson, that her privilege needed to be checked, and that he was the one to do it. He approached her door with aggressive purpose, knocking on the window hard enough to make her flinch, then harder when she didn't immediately respond. His voice was loud enough to be heard through the glass, each word dripping with menace disguised as moral authority. The woman lowered her window just a few inches, enough to hear what he wanted, still maintaining her composure despite the obvious threat. She spoke calmly, her voice steady, asking him to please step back from the vehicle so she could safely leave the area. It was a reasonable request, delivered in a tone that showed respect even in the face of aggression. She wasn't arguing with their right to protest, wasn't challenging their beliefs, just asking for basic human courtesy and the freedom to drive down a public street. But to the man outside her car, that calm reasonableness felt like condescension. He interpreted her composure as evidence that she thought she was better than him, that she was looking down on their cause, that she needed to be humbled. His response was to grab the door handle and yank it, finding it locked, then demand again that she step out of the vehicle immediately, or there would be consequences. The crowd behind him was feeding his aggression, some cheering him on, others filming the confrontation with phones held high, already imagining the viral moment they were capturing. The social media ecosystem had created a perverse incentive structure where the most extreme actions received the most engagement, where shocking people was rewarded with views and shares, where crossing lines became content. This man was performing for that audience, real and digital, escalating because escalation got results in the currency of attention. He circled to the driver's side, continuing to pound on the window, his face now inches from the glass, his eyes wild with the kind of righteous fury that can only come from believing you're on the correct side of history. When she still didn't comply, when she remained seated with that infuriating calm expression, he made a decision that would change his life forever. He reached for something in his pocket, not a weapon, but a multi-tool that could be used as leverage, and worked it into the slight gap at the top of the window. The woman inside could have panicked at this point, could have screamed or laid on the horn or tried to ram her way through the crowd. Instead, she did something unexpected. She unlocked the door herself and stepped out slowly, hands visible, movements deliberate and non-threatening. To the protesters, this looked like submission, like she had finally understood the reality of her situation and was choosing to comply rather than face whatever they had planned. The man who had forced her out of the car immediately moved to establish physical control, grabbing her arm with unnecessary force, positioning himself between her and the vehicle, his body language aggressive and possessive. He was playing to the crowd now, announcing that they were going to search her car for evidence that she was working with ICE or Border Patrol, that she clearly had something to hide given how reluctant she had been to cooperate. What came next would shock even the most radical members of the protest. The man pushed her against the side of her own car, hands spread against the metal, in a mockery of a police pat-down that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with humiliation. His hands moved across her back, down her sides, lingering in ways that made several people in the crowd uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to intervene. This wasn't about finding weapons or contraband. This was about power, about a man who had been given the cover of political activism to assault someone he perceived as powerless. He leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear, telling her that she had made a mistake driving through their protest, that people like her needed to learn respect for the movement, that maybe after this she would think twice before trying to ignore what was happening in her country. The woman said nothing, her muscles tense but controlled, her breathing steady, waiting for something. If you can't stand watching these entitled activists think they're above the law and want to see more reality checks like, what's about to happen here, hit that subscribe button right now. We show you what the mainstream media won't touch. The real consequences when the mob picks the wrong target. Now let's get back to this because you won't believe what happened next. The transformation didn't happen all at once, but in a single fluid motion that most of the crowd missed because they were too busy filming or chanting to pay attention to the details. The woman's posture shifted, her weight redistributed, and suddenly the man who had been pinning her against the car found himself stumbling backward, his wrist bent at an angle that sent pain shooting up his arm. She had moved with the kind of precision that only comes from years of training, the kind of muscle memory that turns your body into a weapon without conscious thought. Her voice changed too, dropping an octave, losing all traces of the diplomatic calm she had shown before. Now she spoke with command authority, the tone that makes people obey before their conscious mind even processes the words. She identified herself clearly and loudly, making sure every phone camera in the vicinity captured the moment, announcing her rank and making it clear that what had just happened wasn't a political confrontation, but a federal crime. The effect on the crowd was immediate and dramatic. The man who had been so aggressive moments before now stood frozen, his brain trying to process the sudden reversal of power dynamics. He looked at her face again and for the first time actually saw her, not as a random civilian to be intimidated, but as someone who carried herself with the bearing of a warrior. The other protesters began backing away, some still filming but now with shaking hands, the realization dawning that they hadn't just harassed a commuter, but had assaulted a United States Army commander who had been traveling through the area on official business. The implications were enormous. This wasn't going to be dismissed as a political disagreement or a protest that got a little rowdy. This was assault on a military officer, battery, kidnapping, and depending on what the investigation uncovered, potentially charges that carried serious federal prison time. The woman maintained her professional composure, but there was steel in her eyes now, the look of someone who had spent years leading soldiers in situations far more dangerous than an urban protest. She kept talking, her voice cutting through the chaos, explaining exactly what laws had been broken and what consequences were coming. She mentioned that her vehicle was equipped with dash cameras and that military intelligence had been monitoring the protest due to concerns about escalating violence against federal personnel. Every second of the assault had been recorded from multiple angles. Every face in the crowd had been captured. Every person who had participated in blocking her vehicle, who had pounded on her car, who had encouraged the assault, was now part of a federal investigation. The man who had touched her was still standing there in shock, his activist confidence completely shattered, replaced by the dawning horror of someone who had just realized they had committed a career-ending felony on camera. The sound of sirens in the distance made several protesters start running immediately, scattering into side streets and alleys, abandoning their signs and masks in their haste to escape. But it was too late for the main aggressor. The commander had already called for backup before exiting her vehicle, following protocol for exactly this kind of situation. She had given him multiple chances to de-escalate, had offered him peaceful exits from the confrontation, and he had chosen violence and humiliation instead. Now he would face the full weight of the justice system that he claimed to be protesting against. Within minutes, 3 military police vehicles and 2 city police cars arrived on scene, officers moving with coordinated efficiency to secure the area and begin taking statements. The remaining protesters who hadn't fled found themselves being identified and questioned, their phones being used to provide evidence of their own crimes, the irony completely lost on most of them. The commander spoke briefly with the ranking MP officer, pointing out the primary aggressor and explaining what had occurred. The man was handcuffed immediately, read his rights in front of the cameras that were still rolling, everyone present getting to watch as he went from righteous revolutionary to common criminal in less than 10 minutes. His voice cracked as he tried to explain himself, claiming he didn't know who she was, that it was just a protest, that he got caught up in the moment. But the commander cut through his excuses with surgical precision. She asked him if he thought not knowing someone's identity made assault acceptable. She asked if he would have treated a man the same way he had treated her, or if he specifically targeted her because she appeared to be alone and vulnerable. She asked if he understood that the way he had touched her, the way he had used his body to trap and intimidate her, met the legal definition of sexual assault under both civilian and military law. Each question landed like a hammer blow, stripping away the political justifications and exposing the raw criminality of what he had done. The real education came when the MP commander, a grizzled veteran with 30 years of service, stepped forward to explain exactly what the young man was facing. Federal charges would be filed within 48 hours. The assault on a military officer meant mandatory minimum sentencing with no possibility of early release. The sexual nature of the contact meant registration requirements that would follow him for life. His social media accounts were already being analyzed to establish whether this was part of a pattern of behavior or a coordinated action against military personnel. If connections were found to any domestic extremist organizations, additional terrorism charges could be added. The career he might have hoped for, the normal life he took for granted, the ability to travel freely or live without supervision, all of that evaporated the moment he decided that political activism gave him the right to put his hands on another person without consent. But the commander wasn't done with him yet. She stepped closer, her voice dropping so that only he and the officers immediately around them could hear, though the nearby cameras still picked up her words. She told him that she had volunteered for 3 combat deployments, had led soldiers through some of the most dangerous situations imaginable, had earned her rank through sacrifice and dedication to something bigger than herself. She asked him what he had done with his life besides harass people at traffic stops. She asked him if he had ever put himself at real risk for his beliefs, or if he just enjoyed the feeling of power that came from targeting people he thought couldn't fight back. She asked him to explain the difference between the fascism he claimed to be fighting and the actual fascist tactic of using mob violence to intimidate and silence people who disagree with you. The questions weren't rhetorical. She waited for answers that never came because he had no answers, just the hollow realization that his entire worldview had been built on a foundation of hypocrisy and self-righteousness. The other protesters who remained were given a choice by the arriving officers. They could provide statements and identification, cooperate with the investigation, and potentially face only minor charges for their roles in the illegal roadblock. Or they could remain silent, obstruct the investigation, and be arrested on the spot for conspiracy to commit assault. Most chose cooperation, suddenly very interested in explaining how they had nothing to do with what happened to the woman, how they were just there to protest peacefully, how they had tried to tell the aggressive guy to calm down, but he wouldn't listen. The phones that had been held up to capture what they thought would be a triumphant moment of resistance were now being handed over as evidence, the videos showing clearly who had encouraged the assault, who had blocked escape routes, who had created the environment where one man felt empowered to commit violence. The digital trail they had created to document their activism was now documenting their crimes. The commander spent another 30 minutes on scene, giving her official statement, coordinating with the military police investigation team, and making sure that every piece of evidence was properly documented. She was professional throughout, showing no satisfaction in the arrests or in the humiliation of the people who had attacked her. This wasn't about revenge for her. It was about consequences, about the rule of law, about the fundamental principle that your political beliefs don't give you the right to assault people. She had taken an oath to defend the Constitution, and that included defending it from domestic threats, from people who thought that the righteousness of their cause justified any action, from mobs who believed that enough people shouting together could override individual rights. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that the protesters who claimed to be fighting fascism had themselves engaged in the exact kind of mob intimidation that actual fascists used to maintain power. As the main aggressor was loaded into the back of a police car, still struggling to process how completely his day had gone wrong, the commander addressed the remaining crowd one final time. She explained that she supported their right to protest, that she had fought to protect that right, that peaceful assembly and free speech were fundamental American values. But she also explained that rights came with responsibilities, that freedom meant respecting the freedom of others, that you couldn't claim moral authority while committing crimes. She told them that the moment they blocked traffic, they crossed from protest into criminal activity. The moment they surrounded vehicles and intimidated drivers, they became kidnappers. The moment one of them decided to assault someone, they all became accessories to that assault. Their choice to participate in an illegal action had consequences, real consequences, not the imaginary consequences of their Twitter arguments, but the kind that involved courtrooms and permanent records and years of probation. She walked back to her car, which now had minor damage from where protesters had pounded on it, documented the damage for her report, and prepared to leave. The street was clear now, the remaining activists having dispersed quickly once the reality of law enforcement arrived. As she drove away from the scene, she called her commanding officer to report the incident, her voice returning to the calm professional tone she had used when first asking to be let through. This was just another day in a career spent dealing with threats, another situation where training and discipline had turned a potential disaster into a textbook response. But for the man in the back of that police car, this was the worst day of his life. The day his activist fantasy crashed into the hard reality of criminal justice. The day he learned that actions have consequences, regardless of how righteous you believe your cause to be. The story spread quickly through military and law enforcement circles as an example of why de-escalation training and professional composure matter, why you never assume someone is helpless just because they appear vulnerable, why doing the right thing means staying disciplined even when you have every reason to lose control. It spread differently through activist networks, where some saw it as police persecution, while others quietly acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, physically assaulting people wasn't the best way to advance political goals. The video footage showed exactly what happened, showed the commander trying to leave peacefully, showed her warnings being ignored, showed the assault occurring, and showed her professional response. There was no ambiguity, no gray area where both sides could claim victimization. Just a clear record of criminals getting caught and facing justice. The final update came weeks later when formal charges were filed. The main aggressor faced 8 separate felony counts, carrying a combined maximum sentence of 20 years. His public defender tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor's office, backed by both military legal counsel and federal attorneys, refused to reduce the charges. This was being treated as an example case, a message to anyone who thought that political protests gave them license to commit violence. He would eventually plead guilty to avoid trial, accepting a sentence of 6 years in federal prison with mandatory registration requirements upon release. His life as he knew it was over, destroyed in the few minutes it took him to cross a line that should never be crossed. The commander went back to her duties, received a commendation for her handling of the situation, and never spoke publicly about the incident beyond her official reports. She didn't need to. The video spoke for itself, a permanent reminder that the real world has hierarchies based on honor and discipline and earned respect, not the social media fantasy where shouting the loudest makes you right. In the end, values like duty and service and self-control prevailed over chaos and intimidation, exactly as they always do when someone actually tests the difference between strength and violence, between courage and aggression, between defending what you believe and attacking people who disagree.